you're receiving handouts. Is there anyone that does not have the handout that's been sent? Okay. They are provided for you. There are 3 sheets that you'll be receiving in connection with some things that we've already gone over and some things that we will be going over. She needs one right over here. Okay. And if you look at that sheet that is entitled Egyptian Kings from the 18th to the 20th dynasties, and you'll notice that I have written some notations on that sheet. You'll notice on the left-hand column there is the list of each king or pharaoh in order, and then you have what's called high chronology, and then low chronology on the right, and then a compromise, Went and Van Sicklen in the middle. Now, I'm not going to go into the reasons why there's a difference in the years of each pharaoh that have reigned. There are definite reasons, but it'd be going too far in the weeds to talk about. Basically, you have the high chronology and the low chronology, which is to say you've got the high chronology that more strictly comports to what the biblical record states, what we can see from the biblical record. The low chronology tries to accommodate archaeological discoveries and what has been interpreted to be the facts as far as the different years of which each of these pharaohs reigned. What I really want you to focus on, though, is what I have notated in connection with these pharaohs. You'll notice up at the top, Moses, I put great-grandfather. Now, who is he the great-grandfather of? You'll notice down on the word Hatshepsut that is underlined. Hatshepsut, in my estimation, is the woman who drew Moses from the Nile River. Now, there are those that would disagree with that, but I follow the lead of Rodney Cloud, who is my main professor at Ambridge University, and he gave a very persuasive case for why Hatshepsut should be the woman who drew Moses from the river. If that is the truth, if that is the case, then Moses would be her great-grandfather. Amenhotep I would be her grandfather. And then Tutmosis I would be her father. Tutmosis I would be the one on the throne when she would draw Moses from the Nile River. And then you'll notice Tutmosis II is notated by me as her half-brother and her husband. It was not unusual at all for pharaohs to intermarry. And that was definitely the case with Hatshepsut. He died under mysterious circumstances. That brings you to Tutmosis III. And if you'll notice down on the bottom by the star, it says Pharaoh of the oppression. That is my estimation, that he was the Pharaoh of the oppression. Tutmosis II was the half-brother and the husband of Hatshepsut. And then you'll see Tutmosis III, actually Tutmosis III is who I was referring to, Tutmosis III, nephew, stepmother, possibly husband, or Hatshepsut would be the stepmother of Tutmosis III. He would be the Pharaoh of the oppression. That give you that correction. So Tutmosis III would be the one that was on the throne when Moses left to go into the Sinai Peninsula, to the wilderness, and then become a shepherd. Tutmosis III was known as the Napoleon of Egypt in that he sent campaign after campaign into Canaan for about 50 years, or about 40 years, I should say. So after the end of Tutmosis III's reign, when he died, Amenhotep II ascended to the throne. Amenhotep II, I believe, is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. I do not believe Ramses the Great was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, as I've presented to you before, but I do believe that Amenhotep II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. As far as we know, Amenhotep II had no biological inheritor of the throne. Does that fit in with the biblical record? Yes, it does. Because Pharaoh lost his firstborn son, as we're going to see. So all of that fits in, as far as I can determine, to what the biblical record states. And of course, there are those that would make the case for Ramses II down underneath the 19th dynasty, if you'll notice that. Ramses II, they would say, would be the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And there are reasons given for that. which, some of them seem to make sense, but in the grand scheme of things, I don't believe it's as persuasive as what I presented to you. But then again, it's not a matter of faith. So we're not saying if you don't take this position, you're unfaithful. Don't misunderstand. I'm just presenting to you one possibility of that. Now, second sheet that I want you to look at is the 10 plagues. The 10 plagues. We are now entering into, in our text, the plagues that God sent upon Egypt. And I want you to overlook the misspelled words. This sheet was made by one of Rodney Cloud's students, and apparently he didn't pay close enough attention to a couple of the words. He misspelled a couple of things, but overlook that. These 10 plagues are grouped into sets of 3. You have the first, the general nuisance plagues. You'll notice the Nile turned to blood, frogs, and the stinging gnats or mosquitoes, and the reference given. Notice, though, on the right-hand column, these plagues were directed against specific Egyptian gods. The Nile turned to blood was directed likely against 3 of those gods. Noom, guardian of the Nile. Hapi, the spirit of the Nile. And Osiris. Nile was the bloodstream of Egypt. These gods were directed against by that specific plague. With the frogs, you have the gods Hecht, the frog-headed goddess of childbirth, a fertility symbol and resurrection, and then Hapi, as has already been noted. The stinging gnats and mosquitoes, we're not really sure exactly which of the deities they were directed against. It could be just a general directing against the gods in a general sense. The second set of 3 devastations, the flies, Exodus 8, the plague on livestock in Exodus 9 was directed against Hathor, the mother goddess, had the form of a cow. Apis, the bull of the god Ptah, the symbol of fertility, and Nevis, the sacred bull of Heliopolis. And then you have the boils of Exodus 9 directed against Imhotep, the god of medicine. Then you come down to the third set of 3, the destruction and death plagues. The plague of hail directed against Nut, the sky goddess. Isis, the goddess of life. Seth, the protector of crops. Locust directed against Isis and Seth. Darkness against Ra, Atum, and Horus, the sun deities. Interestingly enough, later on, after Israel has already left Egypt and has settled in the land of Canaan, you have one of the later pharaohs that does away or tries to do away with all of the gods and goddesses except one, Atum, the sun god. He is known as the monotheistic Pharaoh. Reckon where he got the idea of having one God. I think he got it from the Israelites. But then later on, he is overthrown, and they reestablish the pantheon of gods and goddesses. But those gods and goddesses don't have the same amount of influence and intimidation attached to them as they did before the plagues. And then you have the final plague of death. The death of the firstborn is directed against Pharaoh himself, who is considered to be the god, the representative of all the Egyptian gods, as well as Osiris, who was the giver of life. Now look at the third handout that I've given you, which is more of a written out handout that was given to us in our Genesis-Exodus class under Clyde Woods back in the Freed-Hardeman days. You'll notice these are also the plagues, but there is a progression of these plagues. You'll notice on numbers 1, 2, and 3, you have the riverside, the palace, and then an unannounced plague. That's the progression of these plagues. The water to blood of the riverside, the frogs in the palace. The gnats are unannounced. The magicians then leave after that plague. Then you come to number 4, the riverside, there's the plague of flies, and then the palace, the cattle disease, and then the unannounced plague is the plague of boils, and the servants begin to leave. Then you come to plague 7, the riverside, hail, the palace, locusts, and then the unannounced darkness, and then Pharaoh's entire court leaves. And then that leaves Pharaoh alone when plague 10 hits, the death of the firstborn. Do you see the progression? Do you see what God's doing? God is directing his judgments against the entire religious system of Egypt. Egypt has been, up to this point, the one superpower in all the world, and what's driven that train is their pantheon of gods and goddesses. Everyone thought there must be something to this. Egypt is so successful, it must be because of these gods and goddesses. They've got these magicians and they've got these sorcerers that back up the claim because of all of the sorcery that they're doing, whether it's deception, whether it's demonic power involved. There's something there that's convincing people of the power of these gods and goddesses, and then God comes along and wipes all that out. He says, this is going to cease. And my people are going to go from Egypt back to the promised land. So, that brings us to our text. Exodus, the 7th chapter. We've already seen Aaron's rod has become a serpent. Before we get into our text, though, at verse 14, I want to add something to what we've already seen. Aaron's rod is cast down to the floor, as God had commanded Moses and Aaron. The text, your English text, says it became a serpent and devoured all the other serpents. I pointed out to you that that word for serpent there in chapter 7 is a totally different word from what's used in chapter 4 when Moses is in front of the burning bush and he's told to cast your rod on the ground and it becomes a serpent. That's a different word. That word is the word for a snake. This word in chapter 7, the word serpent, is the word tanin. Now that means nothing to you, but think about this. The word tanin is used in several places in the Old Testament, including the book of Job. Where is it used in the book of Job? When God is talking about Leviathan. Leviathan. Other places in the Old Testament where that particular word is used, it is a big animal of some sort. It is a terrifying animal of some sort. Now, what implication does that leave for us here in chapter 7? That means that when Aaron cast that rod to the floor, it became not just a snake, as you've seen in the movie The Ten Commandments, where it becomes a cobra and it eats all the other cobras. No, no, no. This was a bigger reptile of some sort, a more terrifying reptile of some sort. Yes, sir? Could be. It could have been a crocodile. I would like to think, though, it was some kind of beast that God himself created. It was a unique beast. It was a terrifying beast. That would easily explain how that beast would have devoured all of the other snakes that was in the possession of the magicians. That sort of casts a little bit different light on this, doesn't it? Because of the word that Moses chose to use. He doesn't go into detail to describe what that beast looked like. The English translators have uniformly translated it snake because Moses doesn't give any more description of what took place other than it devoured all those snakes. But because of the way that word is used in other places in the Old Testament, it must be a bigger animal and a more terrifying animal. So not only would that influence the magicians, it would possibly influence Pharaoh. We've got something more than just a parlor trick going on here. This is something more than what these magicians are able to do by their deception or by their demonic acts. This is something more at work. Any other questions, comments about that before we get into our text? I just thought I'd throw that out to you. Randall Bailey wrote a commentary on Exodus, which I have, and he brought out that point, and I never had considered it before. In fact, I only came across that 2 days ago about him writing that about that word and making the case that this is a bigger animal than just a regular snake. And I think he's correct on that. Yes, sir. Yes. That's right. You can't rationalize that. Liberal scholars will say, oh, well, you've got natural phenomenon that explains all those plagues. It's not God doing this. How do you explain the death of the firstborn? How do you explain that? You can't. You can't explain that other than it is the hand of Almighty God behind it. So that brings us to our text. Verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is stubborn. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is going out to the water, and station yourself to meet him on the bank of the Nile. And you shall take in your hand the staff that was turned into a serpent. That same word tanin is used there, by the way. In other words, it would remind Pharaoh of what he could do when he took that staff in his hand to him. Why was he to go to him on the Nile River? Because that is where Pharaoh presented his daily worship to the God of the Nile. That'd be where he'd be. You want to find Pharaoh in the morning? Go right to the Nile. That's where he'd be. So God tells him to do that. Verse 16. You shall say to him, the Lord, that is Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, the God, Elohim of the Hebrews, sent me to you, saying, let my people go that they may serve me in the wilderness. But behold, you have not listened until now. Thus says the Lord, thus says Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, the unpronounceable name of God. By this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, I will strike the water that is in the Nile with the staff that is in my hand, and it will be turned to blood. The fish that are in the Nile will die, and the Nile will become foul, and the Egyptians will find difficulty in drinking water from the Nile. The Nile River is the longest river in the world. The Nile River is what gives Egypt its source of fertility, its source of economic power, and all of this. And of course, they considered the Nile River to be the source of the gods and goddesses. Then the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their rivers, over their streams, and over their pools, and over all their reservoirs of water, that they may become blood. And there will be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. Notice it's not just the Nile River that's being affected. It's every depository, every reservoir, every container of water that is in the entire land of Egypt is going to be affected by this. It's going to be transformed into blood. This is plague number 1, sent against the land of Egypt by God himself. Clyde Woods makes a point in his commentary, if I can get to it, on page 142, concerning this. He says that the expression here, turned to blood, may mean assume the appearance of blood. Even if this be true, however, the plague still involved more than merely the annual reddening of the Nile by silt from upstream. Liberal scholars try to say that's what this turning to blood is. It's just the annual turning of color of the river itself. It's more than just that. Since the plague brought by Moses killed the fish, made the water undrinkable, and was limited to 7 days' duration, none of which accompanied the regular change in the color of the river. That's the big difference. This is a plague more than just that annual coloring. It is the plague of blood. So, verse 20, they did this. Moses and Aaron did even as the Lord had commanded, and he lifted up the staff and struck the water that was in the Nile, in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, and all the water that was in the Nile was turned to blood. The fish that were in the Nile died, and the Nile became foul, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile, and the blood was through all the land of Egypt. Oh yes, this is a nationwide plague. Think about an entire river becoming foul. I don't know if you've ever been around a body of water that turned rancid, but it is horrible. It's horrible to smell. It's horrible to be around. Think about the Nile River itself becoming like that, where you couldn't use it. You couldn't use it at all for bathing. You couldn't use it at all for cooking. You couldn't use it at all for any kind of purpose for 7 days. But, verse 22, the magicians of Egypt did the same with their secret arts. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said. Now, referring back to the movie The Ten Commandments, you'll remember that the head sorcerer says, well, don't you know that there's an annual reddening of the river that takes place? No. These sorcerers, according to Moses, duplicated this miracle. This suggests to me, at least, that this is more than just deception. This is more than just a magician's parlor trick. This is some kind of supernatural force they've got behind them, which I believe would be demonic. They were somehow able to duplicate this. Does this mean that God is not powerful? No. It just simply means that these sorcerers had some sort of satanic power behind them, but it's not going to be able to stand, as we're going to see. Yes, sir. Yes, Moses knew what they could do in their parlor tricks and in their deception, and possibly, even though he doesn't say, he could possibly knows that there's something more at work with what they're doing. But for whatever reason, he knows their game. And he knows that there's going to come a point where they can't outdo him, or they can outdo him anyway. They can't match what he's doing, in other words. But also notice this, in their intent to prove that they are as powerful as God, the magicians are actually helping to destroy the country. Think about it. Because they want to show that they are as powerful as the God of the Hebrews, they're willing to go in and help to destroy their own country with what they're doing. An invading force, as it were. Well, it's interesting. Yes, sir. Yes. If they could have undone this, it would have undermined Moses and Aaron's claim. But God knew they couldn't. And so that was the thing. God knew what they were going to do better than they knew themselves. And remember, Jannes and Jambres are mentioned by Peter as the ringleaders of the sorcerers. They were not only egging on the rest of the magicians to do this, they are also prating against Moses and Aaron with words against them. So all of this is going on at the same time. All of this has influence and impact on Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said. Then Pharaoh turned and went into his house with no concern even for this. Pharaoh is influenced by these sorcerers, and Jannes and Jambres being the ringleaders. Not worried about it. Goes back into his house. So all the Egyptians dug around the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink of the water of the Nile. 7 days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile. A week. You go for 1 day or 2 days without drinkable water and see what happens. Now, to bring it home to us, this would be the same as saying not only is the river, the Mississippi River, the Tennessee River, the Alabama River, all the rivers around here, not only are all they affected by the blood, but also all the lakes, Lake Purdy, Lake Smith Lake, all these other lakes are all affected. And not only that, all the reservoirs are affected. And not only that, you can't buy any water at the store because all of the bottled water is affected. Now think about that. If you can't get any water, period, for a week, do you think you're going to last? It's going to get real hairy, real tricky there. So for a week, They're without any kind of water to drink or to use. All of it's foul, all of it's rancid. Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's good that you had brought that up about the demonic power. Book of Job is showing where the devil is taking Job's body and oil and all types of things that where he's actually doing things to, well, actually Job and his family.
And not just that. You go to the book of Revelation, and the book of Revelation, one of the chapters there, talks about the fact that Satan has been working against the plan of God from the very beginning. Remember what he talks about the woman that sinned into the wilderness? That the dragon is there ready to devour the woman? And then it transforms in that chapter from Israel to the church. In other words, Satan's been at work all this time. Satan is at work here. He's trying to defeat God. He's trying to undermine his plan any way he possibly can do. This is a battle between God and Satan on a cosmic level, as well as a battle between Israel and Egypt. But it's God doing all the work. Notice chapter 8. God now brings the plagues in swift succession. As you see on your sheet, there's a progression. There's a definite structure at work here that God has. Verse 8, chapter 8, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, thus says the Lord, let my people go that they may serve me. But if you refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite your whole territory with frogs. Plague number 2. The Nile will swarm with frogs, which will come up and go into your house, and into your bedroom, and on your bed, and into the houses of your servants, and on your people, and into your ovens, and into your kneading bowls. So the frogs will come up on you and your people and all your servants. Now, I don't know what you think about frogs. I've always been fascinated with frogs. Frogs and lizards. They're interesting animals, to me at least. But if you've got an overwhelming number of frogs in your house, you've got a problem. And when they start showing up in your mixing bowls when you're trying to cook, you got a big problem. And when they're in your bed, you got an even bigger problem. That's what they're facing here. In our back porch every night when the sun goes down and the lights go off, and then I take the dogs out to do their business in the backyard, I turn on the light of the patio, and what do I see on the walls? Lizards. We've got lizards that have taken up residence in our backyard that don't come out until the nighttime. Fascinating gentlemen. Fascinating gentlemen. They turn colors, by the way. Chameleon type lizards. Interesting. But these frogs are a plague. And they are going to be prevalent. Verse 5, then the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the rivers, over the streams, and over the pools, and make frogs come up on the land of Egypt. So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. Notice the magicians did the same with their secret arts, making frogs come up on the land of Egypt. Janus and Jambres are still at work. Still at work with their demonic power, duplicating the plague and intensifying the damage to their own country and people. Yes, ma'am. How much time elapsed between the first plague and the second plague? It seems, because of the progression here, that it was immediate. In other words, after the 7 days were ended, at the end of that chapter, God tells Moses, go and send this plague. In other words, it's one right after the other in rapid fire succession. Just overwhelming. Just like when when the United States invaded Iraq, and they're talking about shock and awe. We're going to have shock and awe. Well, this is the ultimate shock and awe. God was sending these plagues in rapid fire succession, and Egypt could not do a thing about it. So, verse 8. Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, entreat the Lord, entreat Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, that he remove the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go, that they may sacrifice to the Lord. Moses said to Pharaoh, the honor is yours to tell me. When shall I entreat for you and your servants and your people, that the frogs be destroyed from you and your houses, that they may be left only in the Nile? You tell me, when do you want me to do this? Then he said, tomorrow. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, the bard once wrote. Pharaoh's stubbornness is at hand here. So he said, may it be according to your word that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. The frogs will depart from you and your houses and your servants and your people. They will be left only in the Nile. Then Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh. And Moses cried to the Lord concerning the frogs which he had afflicted upon Pharaoh. The Lord did according to the word of Moses. And the frogs died out of the houses, the courts, and the fields, so they piled them in heaps, and the land became foul. There were so many frogs that they were piling up in big mounds, dead frogs all over the country. Think about this. Now, this points forward to Genesis 41, points back to Genesis 41:35. Joseph is said to have piled up the grain. The same Hebrew phrase is used. He piled up the grain for the benefit of Egypt. Because of Pharaoh's stubbornness and intransigence, now they're piling up the dead bodies of the frogs to the detriment of Egypt. Interesting. And the land became foul. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and did not listen to them as the Lord had said. The Lord had told Moses and Aaron, this is what's going to happen. They're not going to let you go. They're not going to let my people go. He's going to be stubborn. He's going to be resistant. His heart will be hardened. And so what does God do? He sort of pushes Pharaoh along. Pharaoh's doing what he wants to do, and God's not going to stand in his way. Then the Lord said to Moses, here's the plague, the first plague that has no warning attached to it. Say to Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth, that it may become gnats through all the land of Egypt. This is plague number 3. Now, some translations have gnats, some translations have lice. Could be the one of those. Most of your Hebrew experts say that this probably describes some sort of insect that was similar to a mosquito. The mosquitoes, of course, are more than just aggravating insects. They can carry disease. They could possibly even kill because of the diseases they carry. So this is some sort of stinging insect, whether you say lice or gnats or mosquitoes, or some other kind of insect that God creates. They did so. This is plague number 3, by the way. And Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and there were gnats on man and beast. All the dust of the earth became gnats through all the land of Egypt. The magicians tried with their secret arts to bring forth gnats, but they could not. Here's the limitation, the first limitation of the magicians, what they could do. So there were gnats on man and beast. Then the magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. That word God is the word Elohim. This is the finger of God. In other words, they did not recognize the God of the Hebrews as being superior to the God of Egypt. They were gods of Egypt. They were just saying this is the finger of God, a God. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had said. These stinging insects, they swarm all around. Have you ever been outdoors where insects are just swarming? It's aggravating. And if you don't have off on you, you don't have any kind of repellent, it's going to be pretty bad. Well, that's the way it was in Egypt. Verse 20. Now the Lord said to Moses, rise early in the morning and present yourself before Pharaoh as he comes out to the water. Here's the first announced plague of the second 3. And say to him, thus says the Lord, let my people go that they may serve me. For if you do not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies on you and on your servants and on your people and into your houses. And the houses of the Egyptians will be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground on which they dwell. Plague number 4, the flies come in. But on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen This is the first time that Goshen is exempted, at least the first time we're told that in the text. Where my people are living, so that no swarms of flies will be there, in order that you may know that I, the Lord, am in the midst of the land. I will put a division between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign will occur. Then the Lord did so. And there came great swarms of flies in the house of Pharaoh and the houses of his servants, and the land was laid waste because of the swarms of flies in all the land of Egypt. Have you ever had a problem with flies in your house? I hope you never have. I hope you never do. It's aggravating as all get out. I remember when I was in high school, one of my teachers said that he had gone to eat at a restaurant not far from where we lived, and he said, the flies were beating on the windows trying to get out of the restaurant. It was that bad. Well, the fact is, the flies themselves in Egypt were not only aggravating, they were contributing to the decimation of the land and the decimation of all the households. So, verse 25, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, "Go, sacrifice to your God within the land." He offers a compromise. I'll let you go to sacrifice, but it's got to be within the land of Egypt. But Moses said, "It is not right to do so. For we will sacrifice the Lord our God what is an abomination to the Egyptians. If we sacrifice what is an abomination to the Egyptians before their eyes, will they not then stone us? It would offend all of the inhabitants of Egypt if we do this. We must go a 3 days journey into the wilderness and sacrifice to the Lord our God as he commands us." Now remember what God had already told Moses. Pharaoh's not going to let you do it. Pharaoh's not going to allow you to go and offer up sacrifice and worship. And get this, verse 28. Pharaoh said, "I will let you go, that you may sacrifice the Lord your God in the wilderness. Only you shall not go very far away. Make supplication for me." You can go, first he says you can go, but just sacrifice in the country of Egypt. Then he says, well, you can go, but don't go too far. And make a sacrifice for me as well. Well, you can tell that Pharaoh's not sincere about it. Then Moses said, "Behold, I'm going out from you, and I shall make supplication to the Lord that the swarms of flies may depart from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people tomorrow. Only do not let Pharaoh deal deceitfully again in not letting the people go to sacrifice the Lord." Moses says, "I'll do what you want us to do and cease this plague, but you better not go back on your word this time." Well, what happens? Verse 30. So Moses went out from Pharaoh and made supplication to the Lord. The Lord did as Moses asked and removed the swarms of flies from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people. Not one remained. Notice that phrase, not one remained. Chapter 14, verse 28, fast forwarding to the destruction of the Egyptian army, it says, not one remained. Same phrase used there. Verse 32, but Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also, and he did not let the people go. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It could very well be the case. I think you make a good point, because it does not say prior to that Goshen was exempted. So you have to assume, as you're suggesting, that Goshen was affected by those first plagues. And that would then show to Israel, the Israelites, that, I'm following up on what I'm saying. But from here on, you're not going to be affected. Remember, the Israelites were having a problem with Egyptian idolatry as well. They were worshiping Egyptian idols. So they were having to be affected to a degree. Yes, sir.
In this particular phrase, it says, Pharaoh hardened their God. So, now it's not God, it's Pharaoh doing his own
God's been sort of pushing him along, allowing him to he's making his own decision, but he's not been standing in his way. But here, Pharaoh makes his decision completely. He hardens his heart. He says, I'm not going to let the people go. Moses already warned him, you better not go back on your word. What does he do? Does exactly as God said he'd do. He's going to go back on his word and not let the people go. But that redounds well for the Israelites. That redounds well for the name of God, because God can now continue to demonstrate his superiority and his power over all the pantheon of Egypt. Yes, sir. The destructive plagues upon man and beast don't begin until those middle set of 3. So that would very well do well in explaining why Israel was not exempted from the first 3. Is nuisance plagues, and it carried with it some destruction into the land, but not necessarily to the people. They could go for a week without water in Goshen, likely, but the frogs and then the gnats, they were nuisance, but they were not necessarily those that would bring death and disease. When you start that second set of 3, that's where the real destructive power begins.
Something else, letting it happen in the land of Goshen. This was making a major, what's it called, manufacturing problem, because these people couldn't make the bricks.
Right. They couldn't create the bricks to build Pharaoh's building projects, and they couldn't contribute to the welfare of Egypt. Maybe, we're being affected, but Goshen's not being affected, so they can't either on those first 3 plagues. But then when it starts affecting everybody individually, that's when it really becomes real for the Egyptians. And that's what we're going to be dealing with when we enter into chapter 9. Next week, we will be entering into those latter plagues beginning, and we're going to see the effect and the impact that it has upon Egypt.